Welcome back to That Was the Week That Was, week 25 of 2023, where Vince McLeod of the Alternative Centre and I review the highlights of the week just been. Hi Vince, and welcome to our first post-solstice show. We're heading back towards the light now.
Hey Bob, yeah, we're certainly heading back towards the light in the southern hemisphere, but some people in the north are not so lucky. Some very dark times coming for them.
Indeed there are. Well, let's just jump straight into it and start off talking about the armed insurrection in Russia. Prigozhin claims that Russia has attacked his forces and declared war. A civil war in Russia would necessitate an end to the hostilities against Ukraine, wouldn't it?
It would be impossible, from my perspective, to see how Russia could possibly expect to win in Ukraine at the same time as fighting a 25,000-man mercenary army that's coming towards Moscow right now. But we don't know. Things could change very quickly in that particular scenario because the Wagner forces that are marching on Moscow could reach there tonight. And already within a few hours, it might be possible that the current Russian government gets deposed. So things can change really quickly. I wouldn't be surprised if Vladimir Zelensky was negotiating peace terms with Prigozhin in 24 hours from now.
Good heavens. Would the West prefer to deal with Putin or Prigozhin as the leader of Russia, do you think?
I think they'd rather deal with Putin based on the devil you know principle, because Putin's been in power for some 30 years, must be close to 30 years, if you count that he was really still in charge when Medvedev was the president. So he really still has wielded power this entire time. I think that the West will look at him and say he hasn't done anything really crazy. He hasn't fired any nukes off in those 30 years. He's invaded Georgia, invaded a few other places. I don't think that they're really that afraid of him, whereas Prigozhin, it's not clear what he could do. He could potentially do anything. He could potentially throw nukes at Ukraine. He could go down in a big ball of fire for all anybody knows. So I think the West would rather have Putin in power, but then maybe not, because rumours say that the CIA has instigated this coup in the first place. So I think the fog of war rule applies again, and we're just going to have to wait and see what happens over the next 24, 48 hours.
Reuters reported last week that both Xi and Biden said that progress had been made in bilateral talks aimed at stabilizing relations between the US and China, but China has refused to accept the US bid to resume military communication channels unless sanctions are removed. So is the talk of progress just rhetoric?
Seems like it's just rhetoric at this stage, but there's a lot of incentive for the American side, in particular Joe Biden, to not want to let China get any ideas. If America would get tied down too much in Ukraine and the war going on in Europe with NATO there against Russia, then that would suggest that Xi Jinping had a chance to strike at Taiwan while America is otherwise occupied. So America doesn't want to occupy. They don't want to project an image of weakness by being too tied down in Ukraine and by giving away too much diplomatically.
Vince, how do you reconcile your rejection of globalism and nationalism with the reality of the rising tensions between China and Taiwan?
It's a really tricky one because in a lot of ways the globalists have an easier answer for when a war breaks out, in that the globalists can act as a police force that stops things from getting out of control. It's not so clear how nationalists would respond to that. For example, the question of one neighbour invading at the other, like in the case of Russia and Ukraine right now. But I think that any realistic world nationalist system would be like a confederation of nations that might have very different laws within the different nations themselves, but they're still willing to operate as a single entity when it comes to things like war on the global level. So I think political philosophy is just going to have to evolve this century, and we'll see what people come up with, hopefully a solution.
Well, this week, the world hung on the edge of their seats, waiting for the implosion of the submersible vehicle Titan to be announced. And as soon as the announcement was made, instead of sympathy, jeering erupted. This is a troubling sign of a culture that's lost its sense of purpose and direction, don't you think?
Certainly that's the case. If you look at when the Trieste was built and deployed, and that was the first submersible that went down to the bottom of the Marianas Trench, just about 11 kilometres below the surface of the ocean. That was in 1953. So that was already 70 years ago that the very bottom of the ocean was being explored. So what's being done with this OceanGate Titan vehicle was nothing original. Wasn't really exploration. It was just a bunch of really rich people spending money on ways that other people can't afford to do. So conspicuous consumption, I think, is the sort of thing that makes people really angry right now when there's such shortages of money everywhere, when so many people are having trouble paying their rent even when they're working 50, 60-hour weeks. So I think that's the reason why a lot of people felt a lot of schadenfreude at the news that the submarine had been destroyed.
How would you foster a culture of excellence to reverse this trend towards resentment and mediocrity, and to restore a sense of pride and aspiration in ourselves and others?
What I would do is to accept that the physical world has mostly been explored completely already. We've been to the moon, we've been to the bottom of the ocean, we've been to everywhere in Antarctica, really, all these places. So now I think it's time to explore the spiritual side of things and try and get a different perspective on how we can view reality rather than looking at it from the material point of view, which doesn't seem to be doing us many favors at the moment. Seems to have led to a lot of war, seems to have led to a lot of overconsumption. I think it's time to move away from that and encourage people and prize people who can do the spiritual exploration instead, and instead of people just spending millions on doing what's already been done decades before. And here I'm not talking just about the OceanGate Titan submersible, but also a lot of this rocket business, which is about sending people to the moon. There's no real advantage to that I see. I see it's probably time to abandon that sort of thing and start exploring the spirit.
The Bank of England shocked the markets and the public last week by raising the interest rate to 5%, the highest level since 2008. How do you explain this sudden and drastic rate hike, Vince?
Simply by the fact that Britain has 10% inflation at the moment. So the Bank of England is still worried about that destroying people's real incomes. There's a lot of discontent at the moment in Britain, especially about how hard it is to pay the rents now and pay the bills. The electricity bills are especially high over there. So they don't want any more pain coming the people's way in form of inflation. So they'd rather hike the interest rate still. I saw that it was predicted that they'll peak at 6%, but that'll depend on how inflation goes. Inflation is falling in America, so if it starts falling in Britain, then perhaps it will peak at 6%, and the suffering won't be too bad.
Well, experts are warning of a mortgage time bomb as households refinance at unaffordable levels. How does the average householder prepare for the worst as times become increasingly uncertain?
The best way is to think about what's a luxury and what's a decency and what's a necessity, and to accurately be able to distinguish between those three categories of goods and services. And the focus, I think, should go now on decencies. Things aren't so bad that we're not at Africa level of poverty or anywhere near it. You know, we're not talking about talking about necessities yet. It's really just about decency. So think about things that will give you a decent quality of life, not necessarily a high quality of life, just a decent one. And what I've done is, for example, is buy a lot of books because they can entertain me for many hours reading them, and it's often only $10 or $15.
Humans have done some amazing things on this planet. Last week, we found out that they have literally moved the earth with their thirst for water. That's quite a feat, isn't it?
That is incredible to me, but it's not, to me, as worrying as what the 8 billion of us have done to the rest of the atmosphere in terms of pumping out all the gases. I'm not talking about carbon dioxide necessarily, but all of the more poisonous byproducts of fossil fuels. So I think it's this, whether or not the story is true or not, I don't know. Could be made up, could be exaggerated, but I think in any case it's a useful reminder just to think about the effect that we're having on the planet.
Do you think that any attempt should be made to stop the pumping and to balance the Earth's axis again? Or should we just let it spin all out of control?
I'm not. I think we'd have to ascertain absolutely for certain that we were actually making it spin out of control. And I think that realistically it's probably not going to matter too much because there's going to be a population collapse soon, and then our ability to do this kind of thing is going to be severely minimized. So I think this is the sort of problem that's going to correct itself probably over the course of the next 200 years.
Well, that should give us enough time. But that's all the time we have for this week. So thank you to all our viewers for joining us once again. And as always, all the links to the articles will be in the description. Please remember to like and to subscribe. And Vince, what a week that was.
Yep, cheers, Bob. We'll hope we make it to the end of next week without nuclear war.
I hope so. The Alt Centre are clown world's good guys. They don't fit into boxes neatly enough to be someone else's tools.